The Sunday morning sun cast long shadows across the peaceful streets of Highland Park, an upscale Washington, D.C. suburb where well-maintained lawns stretched out in front of million-dollar homes. In one of these beautiful houses, 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell stood in her kitchen, making a grocery list while her father, FBI Captain James Mitchell, worked in his home office. Sarah's long braids swayed as she moved around the kitchen, checking the pantry and refrigerator. She wore her favorite Howard University sweatshirt, the college she dreamed of attending next year, along with simple jeans and white sneakers. Her father's voice carried down the hallway as he spoke on the phone about an upcoming FBI operation. "Dad," Sarah called out, walking to his office door. "We're out of almost everything for dinner tonight. Can I take the Mercedes to the store?" Captain Mitchell looked up from his papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. At 45, he cut an impressive figure even in his casual weekend clothes. 20 years of FBI service had earned him not only respect but also the beautiful black Mercedes S-Class that sat in their driveway, a car that still made him smile every time he saw it. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Just be careful with it. You know how some people can be when they see a young person in an expensive car." Sarah nodded seriously. She knew exactly what he meant. Even in their wealthy neighborhood, being black meant dealing with extra scrutiny. Her father had taught her well about handling such situations. Always keep your license and registration ready, be polite but firm about your rights, and most importantly, stay calm. "I remember everything you taught me, Dad," she assured him, taking the credit card he offered. "License and registration are in the glove box. I'll keep my student ID visible too." Captain Mitchell smiled with pride. His daughter was not only an honor student and student government president, but also wise beyond her years. She understood the weight of being a black teenager in America, especially one who sometimes drove luxury cars. "I'll be back in an hour," Sarah said, grabbing the Mercedes keys from the hook by the door. "I'm making your favorite, Mom's lasagna recipe." The mention of his late wife's cooking brought a soft look to the captain's face. "Drive safely, baby girl. Text me when you get there." Sarah stepped out into the bright morning air, her sneakers crunching on the perfectly maintained gravel driveway. The black Mercedes gleamed in the sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the trees that lined their street. She ran her hand along its smooth side before opening the driver's door and sliding into the leather seat. The car's engine purred to life with a gentle push of the start button. Sarah adjusted the mirrors and seat just as she'd been taught in driver's education, then carefully backed out of the driveway. As she drove through their neighborhood, she noticed several neighbors walking their dogs or jogging. Most waved. They knew the Mitchells well, respected the FBI captain and his accomplished daughter. Sarah turned onto the main road, heading toward the upscale Whole Foods where her family usually shopped. She drove exactly at the speed limit, maintaining perfect lane position, habits her father had drilled into her. The car's sophisticated sound system played her favorite playlists softly in the background. At a red light, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror and smiled. Sometimes it still felt surreal, being the daughter of such a successful man, driving this beautiful car, living in this nice neighborhood. Her mother would have been proud to see how far they'd come since the early days when her father was just starting his FBI career. The light turned green, and Sarah accelerated smoothly. She noticed a police cruiser in her rearview mirror but didn't worry. She was doing nothing wrong, and her father's car had all the proper registration and insurance. Besides, this was their neighborhood. Surely the local police knew who she was. Little did Sarah know that this ordinary Sunday morning errand was about to become anything but ordinary. The next few minutes would test everything her father had taught her about dealing with law enforcement, and challenge her faith in the very system her father had dedicated his life to upholding. The police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed in her mirror, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled the Mercedes to the side of the road. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Stay calm, keep your hands visible, and be respectful but know your rights." She took a deep breath and placed her hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the wheel, just as she had practiced. Officer Michael Reynolds sat in his patrol car for an extra minute, studying the vehicle information on his computer. A brand new Mercedes S-Class, worth well over $100,000, being driven by a young black female, it didn't add up in his mind. He had been on the force for 8 years and prided himself on his instincts. Today, Those instincts were telling him something was wrong. He stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached the Mercedes. His right hand rested near his weapon, a habit he'd developed over the years. The morning sun reflected off the luxury car's spotless black paint, almost blinding him as he walked up to the driver's window. Sarah kept her eyes forward, heart pounding but face calm. She had already placed her driver's license and the car's registration on the dashboard where they were clearly visible. The window hummed softly as she lowered it. "License and registration," Officer Reynolds demanded, not bothering with a greeting. His tone was sharp, suspicious. "They're right here on the dashboard, officer," Sarah replied politely, keeping her hands on the wheel. "May I reach for them?" Reynolds nodded curtly, watching her every move. As Sarah handed over the documents, she noticed him call for backup on his radio, a detail that made her stomach twist with anxiety. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered after glancing at the papers. "May I ask why, officer?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly, but she remained composed. "I haven't broken any traffic laws." "Step out of the vehicle now," Reynolds repeated, his voice harder. "And keep your hands where I can see them." Two more patrol cars pulled up behind them, their lights flashing. Neighbors began to peek out of their windows, and a few stopped on the sidewalk to watch. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as she carefully stepped out of the car. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Reynolds instructed. Sarah complied, fighting back tears as she felt cold handcuffs close around her wrists. "Officer, this is my father's car," she tried to explain. "He's FBI Captain James Mitchell. You can call him to verify." "Sure he is," Reynolds cut her off with a skeptical laugh. "And I'm the CIA director. We've had 3 luxury car thefts in this area this month. Care to explain how someone your age is driving a $100,000 vehicle?" A small crowd had gathered now. Sarah recognized Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down, who was recording the scene on her phone. Another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was already on his phone, speaking urgently to someone. "Please, my FBI ID is in my wallet," Sarah said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Along with my student government badge and honor roll certificates. Just check." "We'll check everything back at the station," Reynolds interrupted, beginning to search through her purse. He carelessly dropped her wallet, spilling its contents across the pavement. Sarah's perfect attendance certificates and student ID cards scattered in the wind. One of the other officers approached Reynolds. "Mike, maybe we should verify her story before." "I know what I'm doing, Roberts," Reynolds snapped. "Call for a tow truck. We'll impound the vehicle until we sort this out." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to remember everything her father had taught her about staying strong in difficult situations. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed every instruction, yet here she was, handcuffed on the side of the road like a criminal. What Officer Reynolds didn't know was that Mrs. Peterson's video was already being shared in the neighborhood group chat. And Mr. Thompson hadn't been calling just anyone. He had a direct line to the FBI field office. 3 blocks away, Captain James Mitchell's phone buzzed with multiple urgent messages. As he read them, his face darkened with a mixture of fury and concern. He grabbed his FBI windbreaker and car keys, already heading for the door. The next few minutes would change everything, for Sarah, for Officer Reynolds, and for the entire police department. Captain James Mitchell's FBI-issued SUV tore through the suburban streets, its engine roaring with urgency. His jaw was set tight, and his eyes burned with controlled anger as he read the text messages flooding his phone at each stop sign. His neighbors had sent him pictures and videos of his daughter in handcuffs. 20 years of FBI training had taught him to control his emotions in crisis situations. But this was different. This was his baby girl. Back at the scene, Officer Reynolds was making a show of searching the Mercedes, certain he would find evidence of theft. He pulled out the registration papers again, frowning at the name James Mitchell printed on them. Something in the back of his mind told him he should know that name, but his pride wouldn't let him admit he might have made a mistake. Sarah stood quietly by the police car, still handcuffed. She had stopped trying to explain herself, knowing it was useless. Instead, she focused on the breathing exercises her father had taught her for stressful situations. The growing crowd of neighbors made her feel both embarrassed and somehow safer. There were too many witnesses for anything truly bad to happen now. Mrs. Peterson, still recording everything on her phone, approached one of the other officers. "I'd known that girl since she was 10 years old," she said firmly. "Her father is an FBI captain. Why won't you just call and verify?" Officer Roberts, the younger cop who had tried to warn Reynolds earlier, shifted uncomfortably. He had a bad feeling about this whole situation, but Reynolds was his superior officer. Suddenly, the crowd's murmuring grew louder. A black FBI SUV with government plates turned the corner, its tires screeching slightly as it came to a stop. Captain James Mitchell stepped out, cutting an impressive figure in his FBI windbreaker and badge. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Several of the officers straightened their postures, recognizing the FBI insignia. Officer Roberts' face went pale, but Officer Reynolds, with his back turned while still searching the Mercedes, hadn't noticed the new arrival. "Step away from my car and uncuff my daughter. Now." Captain Mitchell's voice was cold and commanding, carrying the weight of his rank and 2 decades of federal law enforcement experience. Reynolds spun around, his face freezing as he took in the FBI windbreaker, the badge, and the barely controlled fury in Captain Mitchell's eyes. "Sir, we had reports of stolen vehicles in the area." "What reports?" Captain Mitchell demanded, walking closer. "Show me the reports. Show me what probable cause you had to stop my daughter. Show me why you felt it necessary to handcuff an honor student who was driving her father's properly registered vehicle." The other officers quickly moved to remove Sarah's handcuffs. She ran to her father, who wrapped one protective arm around her while keeping his eyes fixed on Reynolds. "Sir, I was just following protocol." Reynolds started to explain, his confidence crumbling. "Protocol?" Captain Mitchell's voice was sharp. "Is it protocol to ignore valid registration? To dismiss FBI identification? To call for backup and handcuff a minor without contacting her parents?" He pulled out his phone, showing the video Mrs. Peterson had sent him. "Is this your definition of protocol, Officer Reynolds?" The gathering of neighbors had grown larger, and many were still recording. Officer Roberts stepped forward, looking ashamed. "Captain Mitchell, sir, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize." "Save it." Captain Mitchell cut him off. "This isn't over. Expect calls from both your chief and the Civil Rights Division tomorrow morning." He turned to the crowd, noting the phones recording everything. "I want copies of all videos sent to my office. This ends today." Sarah, still under her father's protective arm, watched as Officer Reynolds' face turned from red to pale. She saw now what her father had always told her about standing up for what's right, about maintaining dignity even when others try to take it from you. Captain Mitchell took the Mercedes keys from Reynolds' hand. "We're filing a formal complaint. Every second of this stop will be reviewed." He looked at his daughter with gentle eyes. "Let's go home, baby girl. You've been brave enough for one day." As they walked to their cars, neighbors started clapping. Mrs. Peterson came forward to hug Sarah. The scene was ending, but everyone knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. By Monday morning, the incident had exploded across social media. Videos taken by neighbors showed the entire scene from multiple angles. Local news vans parked outside the police station, waiting for official statements. Inside the station, Police Chief Roberts, no relation to Officer Roberts, sat at his desk, watching the viral videos for the 10th time, his face grim with concern. The chief's phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m. The mayor wanted answers. Civil rights organizations were demanding action, but most importantly, the FBI's Civil Rights Division had already launched an official investigation. Meanwhile, at Highland Park High School, Sarah walked through the hallways with her head held high. News traveled fast, and other students looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. Her best friend, Maria, walked beside her, carrying some of Sarah's books. "Everyone's talking about it," Maria said softly. "The video has over 1 million views now. Even my cousins in California saw it." Sarah nodded quietly. She hadn't wanted this kind of attention, but her father had taught her something important last night. Sometimes personal struggles become bigger than ourselves. Dad says what happened to me happens to other people who don't have FBI captains for fathers. Maybe this will help change things. In another part of town, Officer Michael Reynolds sat in a small room at Internal Affairs, sweating under the bright lights. 2 investigators sat across from him, playing the videos from yesterday. Explain to us again, one investigator said. Why you felt it necessary to call for backup and handcuff a minor who provided valid registration? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The arrogance from yesterday had drained from his face. I thought the car might be stolen. There had been some thefts in the area. Really? The other investigator cut in. Because we checked the records. There hasn't been a single luxury car theft reported in your patrol area this year. Want to try again? Back at the FBI office, Captain Mitchell was in a meeting with civil rights attorneys. Papers and photographs covered the conference room table as they built their case. His phone buzzed. Another message from a parent whose child had faced similar treatment from Officer Reynolds in the past. That makes 5 complaints against the same officer, one attorney said, adding the message to their file. All involving minority youth, all involving expensive cars or being in unexpected neighborhoods. Captain Mitchell nodded, his face serious. This stops now. Not just Reynolds. We need department-wide change. New training protocols, new accountability measures, everything. At home that evening, Sarah sat with her father in their living room. The Mercedes was parked safely in their garage, but somehow it didn't shine as brightly anymore. Local news played quietly on their TV, showing clips from yesterday's incident. Are you okay, sweetheart? Captain Mitchell asked, noticing Sarah's quiet mood. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. I am, Dad. But I keep thinking about what you said. About other kids who don't have parents with badges. What happens to them? Her father smiled proudly. Despite everything, his daughter was thinking of others. That's why we're fighting this fight. The police chief called today. They want you to speak at their new officer training program. Share your story, help them understand the impact of their actions. Sarah's eyes lit up. Really? You think I should do it? Only if you want to, he replied. But sometimes the best way to create change is to share our stories, to help others understand. As they talked, Sarah's phone kept buzzing with support messages from friends and neighbors. Mrs. Peterson had organized a community meeting for next week to discuss police-community relations. The local youth council wanted Sarah to lead a workshop on knowing your rights. What had started as a terrifying traffic stop was turning into something bigger, a catalyst for change, a moment of awakening for their community. Sarah realized that sometimes life's worst moments could lead to the most important opportunities. The news anchor on TV announced that Officer Reynolds had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but for Sarah and her father, this wasn't about punishing one officer. It was about making sure no other young person would have to go through what she did. 1 week after the incident, Sarah stood at a podium in the police department's training room. 50 police officers sat before her, some looking uncomfortable, others genuinely interested. Her father stood at the back of the room, giving her an encouraging nod. I was taught to respect police officers, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. My father, an FBI captain, made sure I knew exactly what to do during a traffic stop. I followed every rule. I kept my hands visible. I spoke politely. I had all my documents ready. She paused, looking around the room. But none of that mattered because Officer Reynolds had already decided I didn't belong in that car. In the third row, Officer Roberts, who had been present during her arrest, lowered his head. Next to him, several younger officers took notes. The police chief sat in the front row, his face serious as he listened. When you put those handcuffs on me, Sarah continued, you didn't just restrain my hands. You attacked my dignity. You made me feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood, in front of people who have known me my whole life. The room was completely silent now. Even the usual shuffling of papers and squeaking of chairs had stopped. Meanwhile, across town at the FBI office, Captain Mitchell's team was reviewing more cases. They had discovered 20 similar incidents in the past year alone. Young minorities stopped while driving expensive cars or walking in wealthy neighborhoods. Most victims hadn't filed complaints, believing nothing would change. Back in the training room, Sarah showed the viral video of her arrest. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they watched their colleagues' behavior. This could have ended differently, Sarah said. If I didn't have an FBI captain for a father, if neighbors hadn't recorded everything, if I had reacted with the anger I felt, would I be standing here today? Or would I be another statistic, another resisting arrest case? The police chief stood up after Sarah finished speaking. Thank you, Miss Mitchell. Your courage in sharing this story will help us do better. He turned to face his officers. Starting today, we're implementing new training programs. Every officer will wear a body camera. And most importantly, we're creating a civilian review board to examine complaints. After the session, several officers approached Sarah to thank her. One older officer had tears in his eyes as he spoke to her. I have a daughter your age, he said quietly. Watching that video made me think about how I treat young people during traffic stops. Thank you for opening my eyes. That evening, a community meeting was held at the local library. The room was packed. Black and white families sat together, all wanting to be part of the change. Mrs. Peterson, who had recorded the original video, presented a petition with over 5,000 signatures demanding police reforms. Sarah sat with her father, watching as neighbors shared their own stories. Some were speaking out for the first time, encouraged by her example. The atmosphere was not angry, but determined. People wanted change, not revenge. The biggest surprise came when Officer Roberts stepped up to the microphone. I was there that day, he admitted. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I stayed quiet. That silence made me part of the problem. I'm here to learn how to be part of the solution. Local news cameras recorded everything. The reporter who had first broken Sarah's story was there, taking notes. What had started as one wrong traffic stop was growing into a movement for change. After the meeting, Sarah's father hugged her tightly. Your mother would be so proud of you, he whispered. You're turning pain into progress. Sarah smiled, thinking about all that had happened in just 1 week. The scared girl in handcuffs was becoming a voice for change. She had learned that sometimes life's worst moments could lead to the most important opportunities. As they drove home in the Mercedes, the same car that had started it all, Sarah noticed Officer Roberts directing traffic outside the library. He gave her a respectful nod as they passed. Small changes, she thought, but they all add up to something bigger. 1 month after the incident, Officer Michael Reynolds sat alone in his apartment, staring at the disciplinary letter on his coffee table. The internal investigation had found him guilty of racial profiling and abuse of power. He was suspended without pay for 60 days and required to complete extensive sensitivity training. The once proud officer had spent weeks reflecting on his actions. The viral videos of him handcuffing Sarah played constantly on news channels. His own teenage daughter had stopped speaking to him after seeing them, saying she was ashamed of her father's behavior. That morning, Reynolds made a decision that surprised everyone. He requested a meeting with Sarah and Captain Mitchell through his union representative. He wanted to apologize in person, not because he had to, but because he knew he needed to. The meeting was arranged in a conference room at the FBI office. Sarah sat between her father and Mrs. Peterson, who had become like a second mother to her since the incident. When Reynolds walked in, he looked different, humbled, smaller somehow, without his uniform and badge. Miss Mitchell, Reynolds began, his voice shaking slightly. I've spent weeks trying to understand why I did what I did that day. I told myself I was following protocol, doing my job, but the truth is, I saw a young black person in an expensive car and made assumptions. I was wrong. Sarah listened quietly, her face calm but serious. Her father's hand rested protectively on her shoulder. The hardest part, Reynolds continued, was explaining to my own daughter why I treated someone her age that way. She asked me if I would have done the same thing if it had been her friend Emily, who is white, driving her dad's BMW. He paused, wiping his eyes. I couldn't answer her because we all know the truth. Captain Mitchell spoke up. Recognition of bias is the first step, Officer Reynolds. What matters now is what you do with that understanding. Reynolds nodded. That's why I'm here. I want to volunteer to work with your new youth outreach program. Not as a police officer, but as someone who needs to learn and change. If you'll have me. Meanwhile, positive changes were spreading through the police department. The new Civilian Review Board had already handled 15 cases, making sure every complaint was taken seriously. Officer Roberts had started a mentorship program, connecting officers with local teenagers to build trust and understanding. Sarah's story had reached national news. She was invited to speak at police academies across the state, sharing her experience to help train new officers. Her school principal asked her to lead workshops on civil rights and community activism. That evening, Sarah and her father attended a special city council meeting. The mayor was signing new legislation requiring body cameras, bias training, and community oversight for all police officers. The room was packed with supporters, including many of the neighbors who had witnessed Sarah's arrest. 1 month ago, the mayor announced, "Our community witnessed something that opened many eyes." Today, thanks to the courage of Sarah Mitchell and the leadership of her father, we're taking steps to make sure it never happens again. As people applauded, Sarah noticed Officer Reynolds sitting quietly in the back row. He wasn't in uniform, but he was there, listening and learning. His daughter sat beside him, holding his hand. They had started talking again after he admitted his mistakes and committed to change. After the meeting, Reynolds approached Sarah one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping me become a better person and a better father." Sarah smiled slightly. "Just remember this feeling the next time you see someone who doesn't fit your expectations." On the drive home, Captain Mitchell looked at his daughter proudly. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes the biggest changes start with the hardest moments. You've helped create real change here." Sarah watched the streetlights pass by, thinking about everything that had happened in just 1 month. The scared girl in handcuffs had found her voice, and that voice was helping to build bridges between police and community. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah noticed new faces at the neighborhood watch meeting next door. Black and white families sat together, planning community programs. Officer Roberts was there too, out of uniform, just another neighbor helping to make things better. 6 months after the incident, Sarah stood on a much bigger stage, the National Conference on Police Reform in Washington, D.C. Hundreds of police chiefs, civil rights leaders, and government officials filled the audience. Her father sat in the front row, beaming with pride. "What happened to me was not unique," Sarah began, her voice stronger now after months of public speaking. "What made my story different was that it was caught on video, and I had an FBI captain for a father. But for every story like mine that makes the news, there are hundreds that don't." The audience listened intently as she shared how her community had transformed over the past 6 months. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing statistics from their town. Traffic stops down by 40%. Civilian complaints reduced by 60%. Community trust in police up by 45%. Zero racial profiling incidents in the past 5 months. In the middle of the audience sat Officer Reynolds, no longer suspended, but now working in the Community Relations Division. He had become an unexpected ally in police reform, sharing his story of transformation at training sessions. His daughter sat beside him, now proud of how her father had changed. "Change is possible," Sarah continued, "but it requires 3 things: honest acknowledgement of bias, willingness to learn, and community involvement. We've seen this work in our town." The presentation showed photos of their new programs: weekly community police basketball games, youth leadership councils with police participation, joint neighborhood watch programs, regular town halls where officers and residents could talk openly. Back in their hometown, things had indeed changed. Officer Roberts, now promoted to sergeant, ran the new Community Engagement Division. The suspicious stares and tense traffic stops that used to plague minority residents had been replaced with friendly waves and respectful interactions. Mrs. Peterson had been elected to the Civilian Review Board, where she worked to ensure fairness in police complaint investigations. Her video of Sarah's arrest was now used in police training academies across the country as an example of what not to do, and how to make it right. After Sarah's speech, several police chiefs approached her and Captain Mitchell. They wanted to implement similar programs in their cities. Sarah's story had become a blueprint for positive change. That evening, at a dinner hosted by the conference organizers, something unexpected happened. A young black teenager approached Sarah's table with tears in her eyes. "Your story saved me," the girl said quietly. "Last month, I was stopped by police while driving my mom's new car. I remembered your video, stayed calm, and asked them to call my parents. The officers actually listened. One of them had seen your speech at their training." Sarah hugged the girl tightly, fighting back her own tears. This was why she kept telling her story, even when it was hard to relive that day. Later that night, in their hotel room, Captain Mitchell found Sarah looking out the window at the Capitol building glowing in the distance. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, standing beside her. "I was just thinking about Mom," Sarah replied softly. "Remember how she always said that bad things happen so we can learn to make good things? I finally understand what she meant. Her father nodded. She would be so proud of how you've turned your pain into purpose. You're not just telling your story anymore, you're helping write a new one for communities everywhere. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Officer Reynolds. His daughter had just been accepted to college and wanted to study criminal justice, inspired by Sarah's work in police reform. He thanked her again for helping him become someone his daughter could be proud of. As Sarah got ready for bed, she thought about how far they'd come from that terrifying Sunday morning. The incident that could have left her bitter had instead made her stronger, more determined to create change. Tomorrow, she would speak to another group of police officers and community leaders. But this time, she wasn't just sharing a story of injustice, she was sharing a roadmap for transformation, proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged with understanding, courage, and commitment to change. 1 year after the incident, Sarah Mitchell stood in her graduation gown, preparing to give her high school valedictorian speech. The school auditorium was packed, but this time she wasn't nervous. The past year had taught her that her voice mattered. Looking out at the audience, she saw many familiar faces. Her father sat in the front row, camera ready. Mrs. Peterson wiped tears from her eyes, sitting next to Officer Reynolds and his daughter Emma, who had become one of Sarah's closest friends. Sergeant Roberts was there too, in his dress uniform, representing the police department that had changed so much. A year ago, Sarah began, I was handcuffed on the side of the road for driving my father's car. Today, I stand before you as proof that one moment doesn't define us. What we do after that moment does. The audience listened intently as she continued. Our town has become a national model for police reform. But more importantly, we've become a model for how communities can grow stronger through understanding and forgiveness. She shared the latest achievements. Their police reform program had been adopted by 50 other cities. Reports of racial profiling had dropped to near zero. The Community Police Advisory Board, which now included students, met weekly. Their town had won a national award for community policing. Captain Mitchell watched his daughter with pride, remembering how she had transformed from a scared teenager in handcuffs to a powerful voice for change. Next fall, she would attend Georgetown University on a full scholarship, planning to study law and civil rights. Officer Reynolds, now the department's chief diversity trainer, sat quietly in his seat. His own journey from being the officer who handcuffed Sarah to becoming an advocate for change had inspired many others. His daughter Emma had started a youth police advisory council, bringing together teenagers and officers for regular discussions. After the ceremony, everyone gathered at the Mitchells' house for a celebration. The same Mercedes that had sparked the incident sat in the driveway, now a symbol of how far they'd come. Officers and neighbors chatted together comfortably on the lawn, sharing food and stories. Sarah found a quiet moment to sit with her father on their porch swing. Dad, she said softly, do you think Mom would be proud of how we handled everything? Captain Mitchell smiled, pulling out an old photo of Sarah's mother from his wallet. Baby girl, she would be beyond proud. You didn't just overcome injustice, you helped create lasting change. Inside the house, Mrs. Peterson showed new neighbors the famous video that started it all, but now, the video was followed by clips showing positive changes. Community basketball games with police officers, youth mentoring programs, and town halls where everyone's voice was heard. Officer Reynolds approached Sarah with his daughter. I have something to tell you, he said. I've been offered a position to head a new police reform training program in Chicago. They want to use our town's model there. Sarah hugged both him and Emma. Who would have thought that traffic stop would lead to all this? She said, smiling. As the evening went on, Sarah's phone kept buzzing with acceptance letters from youth leadership programs and invitations to speak at police academies. But what made her happiest was seeing her community transformed. Children played freely in the streets, no longer afraid of police cars. Officers walked their beats greeting residents by name. Trust had replaced fear. Before the party ended, everyone gathered for a group photo. There stood Sarah, between her father and Officer Reynolds, surrounded by a community that had learned to face its problems and grow stronger. The photo would later hang in the police station lobby, with a simple caption, Change begins with us. As guests left, Sarah stood in her driveway, watching police cars drive by with their lights off, just regular parts of a peaceful neighborhood. She thought about all the other young people who would never have to go through what she did, thanks to the changes they'd made. Her father joined her outside. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked. Sarah nodded, looking at the stars above their changed community. "Ready," she replied. "This isn't the end of our story, it's just the beginning of a better one."